Okay, welcome to video 3. This lecture is titled The Birth of the Modern. Our time-traveling alien has been to the Mughal Empire and has just come back from China, which were two of the world's largest empires. Now, Marvin the Martian descends onto Europe, which was a divided continent in 1688 and still did not seem nearly as powerful as its Asian counterparts. Europe was, however, in a state of change, and that is what set their civilization apart. To understand why Europe was changing in 1688 and on the verge of modernity, Marvin the Martian will actually need to go back further in time. Therefore, this video will attempt to teach the history of Europe from 1347 through 1688 in just 10 minutes. Please note that in previous classes we would spend all semester, literally 50 classes, covering this material in detail. So buckle your seatbelts because this is going to be a bumpy ride. The year is now 1347. Europe in the 1300s was living in a feudal world. Feudalism is this giant concept that covers all aspects of society at the time: social hierarchy, economics, culture, and politics. The main point is that feudalism kept Europe stagnant. What was the social hierarchy of feudalism? Well, there were three groups: nobles, priests, and serfs. The nobility controlled the land, and technically they were supposed to protect society from outside invaders. The priests were, of course, Catholic, which means universal, and they were led by the Pope in Rome. Their job was to pray and save souls from eternal damnation. Then there were the serfs, who were the vast majority of the population. Their job was to work the land owned by the nobles. These serfs had to pay what was called manorial dues. A manor was the land owned by by the noble, which meant that the serfs had to give a large part of their harvest each year to the noble, provide free labor to the noble, and finally serve in the noble's army. On top of all this, serfs also paid annual tithes or taxes to the Catholic Church. Essentially, the serfs were the slaves to the nobility and the church. The main point is again that medieval Europe was stagnant and nothing had really changed for centuries. Economically, serfs did not own property, so there was very little buying and selling. There were no new businesses. Politically, the nobles in the Catholic Church held most of the power, not the kings. Socially, people were stuck in the same status into which they were born. And finally, intellectually, the Catholic Church controlled higher education, educating priests in Latin. But then things started to change, and there were four major shocks to feudalism that shook Europe out of its complacency. The first shock to feudalism was the Black Death, which first arrived in Europe in 1347, but returned periodically for about 400 years. The Black Death was a plague or a virus, perhaps even the Ebola virus. It wiped out 1/3 of the population of Europe. In cities, the number of dead ran as high as 2/3 of the population. But how did all this death actually change feudalism? Well, now I want you to pretend that you are one of the surviving serfs, so you survived the plague. Half of your village is dead. The noble, if he's still alive, all of a sudden needs you more than you need him. He needs your labor to collect the harvest, and he might be even willing to pay for it. If he doesn't pay you, you now can run away to the next village where another noble is willing to pay you. Then you start to save your money, and maybe you have enough money to buy some land. And remember, there are less people out there, but the supply of land remained constant, which means the price of land actually goes down. And once ordinary people start buying and owning land, feudalism is effectively over. Land, above all, was the source of the nobility's power. The second shock to feudalism, and this is a cultural and intellectual shock, was the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and in this case, it was the rebirth of Roman and Greek culture. So when we say Renaissance, we're not really talking about a time period. We're actually talking about a movement of individual artists, musicians, philosophers, men who combined Christianity with the art and philosophy of the pre-Christian classical world. You can see this combination of Christianity and ancient art in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. Michelangelo adopted the realism of Greek art with Christian themes. You can see it in the philosophy of Erasmus, who argued that the Bible should be translated into local languages so that ordinary people could understand it. And then there was also Machiavelli, who advised rulers that Christian morality was irrelevant to their power. What was important, according to Machiavelli, was maintaining control, even if you had to lie, murder, and steal to do it. And again, Machiavelli looked to the ancient Greeks and Romans as role models, not to Christianity. And finally, you could see it with Copernicus, who studied Greek astronomy and ultimately disagreed with both the Christians and the ancient Greeks' view that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Instead, Copernicus believed the universe was heliocentric, sun-centered. What Europe experienced in the 1400s and 1500s was the start of a new culture in which intellectuals disagreed with each other and they also disagreed with the traditions of the past. And in the process, these intellectuals produced new ideas on everything from music, art, politics, science, and theology. And in the midst of this thing called the Renaissance, another thing happened, and that was the Reformation, which was the third shock to the feudal world. The Reformation was a religious upheaval within the Catholic Church that lasted from 1517 to 1648. Reformers, obviously, were demanding change from the Catholic Church. And it all began with this man, Martin Luther, who in 1517 was a 34-year-old Catholic monk from Germany. But in October of that year, in 1517, Luther became frustrated with the Catholic Church practices, and he wrote the 95 Theses, which attacked the Catholic Church for selling indulgences. An indulgence was a fee that the Church charged ordinary people in order to guarantee that these people and their loved ones would spend less time in hell after they died. To make a long story short, Luther became increasingly emboldened in his criticism of the Church. Reformers like Luther eventually rejected the fundamental tenets of the Catholic faith. Catholics believed that a Christian had to perform 7 sacraments such as communion, baptism, and the confession of sins, all in order to receive salvation. But for Luther, salvation could only be achieved through faith, and faith alone. Luther ignited a religious revolution. Peasants rose up against not only Catholicism, but also the nobility. Frustrated with Catholicism, Europeans created dozens of various sects of Christianity. There were the followers of Zwingli, there were Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Anglicans, just to name a few. The Catholic Church responded with renewed efforts to maintain their hold on power, creating groups like the Jesuits, who were essentially warrior monks. The result was nearly 150 years of constant warfare in Europe. These kingdoms divided between the various sects, with various rulers choosing one faith over the other. How did this carnage shock feudalism out of its complacency? For one, the Catholic Church lost its grip on their power over both kings and also over ideas. Finally, the experience of the bloodbath that was the Reformation left some Europeans disillusioned with religion altogether. Again, Europe was inching its way to the modern world in which tradition as a whole would be dumped for the sake of change and hopefully progress. The fourth and final shock to feudalism was the rise of monarchies. If you remember, during the Middle Ages, kings actually held less power collectively than the nobility. Kings had to rely on the nobles for their army and on nobles as a source of their revenue. Then 2 things changed, and this all began in the 1400s. First, there were European wars. Second came overseas empires. France, England, and Spain all experienced major conflicts in the 1400s. France fought the 100 Years' War with England, then England had to fight a civil war with itself called the Wars of the Roses, and finally Spain fought a war against the Moors, or Muslims, who were still living in the Iberian Peninsula. To win each of these separate conflicts, European monarchs started to do something that they had never done before. They created direct taxes or tithes on land. Taxes on land used to be something reserved solely for the nobility, but the necessity for an army propelled the kings to create a direct source of revenue. These new taxes were then used to create a professional standing army. They were professional because they were paid. And again, during feudalism, armies were effectively large masses of serfs working for nobilities who could go back to the fields after the battle. With a standing army, part of these new armies meant that they never went back to the fields. They were professional. Warfare was their permanent career. As the 1500s and 1600s progressed, kings used these professional standing armies to not only fight other kings, but also to consolidate their power within their kingdoms. That meant fighting their own nobility. The second cause for the rise of monarchs was this thing called the Age of Exploration. So I hope that you remember that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, it was the newly empowered king and queen of Spain who sent Columbus east across the Atlantic to find a trade route with Asia. Columbus, instead of finding Asia, stumbled upon two continents that about which Europeans were oblivious. This became known as North and South America. Again, to make a long story short, Spaniards, Portuguese, the English, the French, and the Dutch, all of them conquered these two continents. They did so with the help of smallpox, wiping out the native population and establishing a new system of trade based on slaves from Africa, sugar grown in the New World, and guns produced in Europe. Needless to say, this made Europeans wealthy, but it also provided a new source of income for the rising power of the monarchies. Okay, so now we're back to 1688. We've thrown our Martian into a crazy period in European history. Everything in Europe is now in a state of flux. Ordinary people are making money for the first time, creating businesses, trading stuff, and buying land that was once reserved for the nobility. Traditional religion has been blown up, and sometimes quite literally blown up. Philosophers, scientists, and artists are pushing each other to come up with new ideas and new methods for discovering truth. And finally, a new kind of monarch has consolidated power, creating for the first time unified nation-states in Europe. We'll spend tomorrow's class getting to know one of these monarchs, the most powerful of them all, Louis XIV of France.